Hey everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day and thanks so much for joining me today for another art video. In today's video, I'm going to be sharing my watercolor painting process for a study of a stack of colorful rocks. I definitely say that this painting process is slightly more intuitive and experimental in nature than other painting processes and tutorials that I've shared in the past, because both the outline sketch as well as the color selection and all of that were basically thought of from imagination. I didn't really use any specific reference photo, but what I did instead was I went into Google and got inspired by a bunch of different photos that I saw of stacks of rocks. And then once I had that visual information kind of in my mind, I then removed myself from all of those references and just created this from imagination. Even though I wanted to keep this more experimental, I wanted to have fun with that color, and I created this from imagination, I did want to make sure to bring in a certain level of realism into this piece, a certain degree of realism. And two things that I wanted to make sure to take into account to create that sensation of realism was the overall structure of these rocks, their three-dimensional form, or the planes, the curves making up their structure, as well as B, the cast shadows that these rocks would create upon each other. Because both of these things are key behind creating artwork that looks a little bit more realistic. Understanding things as having form, as well as understanding light behavior. So where is the light source located in relation to the subject? And how would these little structures create a cast shadow upon each other, taking that light source into account and all of that. If we don't understand our subject as having volume, as having mass, as having a three-dimensional form or structure, and we don't understand light behavior, at least at a basic level, and we fail to keep those highlights, those cast shadows, and all of that consistent throughout the image or the painting, then we're going to be having a very hard time making something look believable. Okay, so with all of this in mind, I allowed myself some space to play with color. And as always, it was important to create a wide variety of translucencies and values in this piece. Again, taking into account that light situation that I had going on and keeping it consistent throughout. Okay, so what you're seeing me work on right now is I am preparing my first set of color mixtures so that I can get started with my painting process. For this piece, I used a total of 6 different colors, and these colors are Indian yellow, burnt sienna, Mars brown, raw sienna, madder lake red light, and indigo. All of these colors are from my St. Petersburg White Nights full pan paint set. And I'm going to be working today on a sheet of watercolor paper from Strathmore. This is one of their ready-cut 100% cotton, 140-pound, 8x10 watercolor sheets. Aside from this, I'm going to be using 3 different watercolor paintbrushes, and these are all from a brand called Magritte that I bought via Amazon. I quite like them, and they are all rounds in sizes 6, 5, and 2. As always, you're going to be able to find links to all of these supplies down below in the description box of this video in case you'd like to go and check them out. All right, so using my 6 different colors, I created a variety of different colors for myself to get started. You can see how some of these are the pure color in and of itself with a bit of water, and other color mixtures are combinations of 2 of these aforementioned colors. I knew since the beginning that I wanted this stack of rocks to be colorful. I didn't want all of my rocks to be gray. And so taking into account all of the different colors that I saw in those reference photos over on Google, I just took note of them. I selected my colors from my St. Petersburg set that I thought could work well. And then what I did there on my color mixing palette was I prepared some colors for myself to get started. So as you can see right here, I have the pure indigo with a little bit of water in it. I prepared myself some gray by mixing together the indigo with the Mars brown. I have some lighter browns, some mid-tone browns, some darker browns. I prepared a purple by mixing together the indigo with the Madder Lake. I have some pure Madder Lake there for me. And throughout the painting process, you're gonna see me constantly add more of one color or another color, or make it more saturated, or bring in more water to make it more translucent, etc. Okay, so I'm gonna go ahead and get started with the very first rock here. This is my size 6 round brush. And I decided that this top rock would be sort of a reddish brown color. And so what I do was I prepare my paintbrush bristles first by dipping my paintbrush in my container of water. I remove the excess water and I grab some of the lighter golden brown that I prepared for myself. And you're gonna notice that with every single rock that I paint, I always get started with the lightest color in a very translucent or watered down state. Why? Because I personally like going in light and translucent, making sure that I am keeping my highlights protected, working around those highlights. And then I am basically starting to create the lighter values with that paint in a light translucent state. And then once that initial layer of paint is there, I start dropping in darker colors, whether it's that same initial color in a more saturated state, or whether it's the next brown that I'm going to be using for this rock. I like taking it a step forward into darker colors or darker values incrementally. I find this gives me more control, and this allows me to create a wide variety of different values, starting from lightest lights, which are basically little areas in which the paper is shining through completely, standing in place for those highlights. I like creating a wide range of midtones, lighter values, darker midtones, and then pushing those darkest darks, because it's ultimately this wide variety of different values and levels of translucency that is going to make something look a little bit more 3D. Throughout this painting process, you're gonna see me drop in a bit of color at a time. And once I feel I've dropped in enough color, I remove all of the color from my paintbrush bristles by swiveling my paintbrush in my container of water, removing the excess water by gently scraping my paintbrush bristles alongside the top of my container there. I'm also constantly using my absorbent towel that I have right there beside me, as you can see. And then I am going in and doing gentle moving around of that color. If I feel I need to move that color around a tiny bit, whether it's to soften edges or bring that color expanded a little bit more into another area, or whether I'm going to be doing some pulling to start describing some texture, I am doing it with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush and shifting between my different paintbrush sizes depending on what it is that I am doing. If I am doing scribbling or gentle kind of sideways strokes to describe some of that texture of the rock, then maybe I switch on over to the smallest brush. If I am doing some pulling into larger areas, I use one of the medium-sized brushes or larger brushes. And then if I want to darken certain areas a little bit more, I drop in a little bit of that darker color only into those areas that I want to darken further. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that first layer of paint in that first rock, and I am allowing it to dry completely now. You can see how I've saved some highlights, and you can also see how I have managed to develop a wide range of values and translucencies. In some sections that brown looks very light and translucent, and in other sections it looks very dark and saturated. Now watercolor always tends to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so we'll come back to see later how much some of these darker browns have lightened. For now, I am getting started with the second rock, and you can see how I've skipped over the rock that is right underneath the one that we were just previously working on. And the reason this is because if I had started to work on that rock right beneath it, because that brown is still wet, if I had started wetting that second rock beneath it, that brown would start bleeding into the new wetness that I create, because watercolor is always going to expand into paper that is wet. And so you're gonna see me skip a rock as I move through this painting process. Okay, so right here, working on this purple rock, you saw me just a moment ago get started with what I could call my base purple that I chose for this rock in a very light translucent state. I'm using my size 6 round brush once again. I always get started with the larger brush, and then once I move forward, I switch on over to the smaller ones. As I am creating those textures and doing any pulling and things that I want to move around a tiny bit or darken a tiny bit, I switch to the smaller brushes. But once again, I got started with that color in a very light translucent state, and then I went in with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush to move that color around, make sure that I had pre-wetted everything with that very light translucent initial color except for the highlights, which you want to keep dry. If you don't keep those highlights dry, then the color is going to bleed into them and you're going to be left with no highlights. So make sure that you're working around those highlights, and once your initial translucent color has been laid down, you can go in and start dropping in either the same purple in a more saturated state, meaning less water in that color mixture, or you can switch on over to the next color. So for me, the next color with this one was the indigo, and I dropped in the indigo only into the areas that I wanted to darken further, which in this case, we definitely have a nice area of cast shadow created by the rock right on top of this one. And you're also going to see me drop in a little bit of darker, more saturated color throughout some of the sections of core shadow in all of these rocks to further describe their three-dimensional structure. So the core shadow is a belt of darker values that a lot of curved objects are going to have, because what happens with curved objects such as these is that there is a division between the planes that are facing towards the light and the planes that are facing away from the light. I have a full class on the basics of light behavior over on Patreon, available for the $15 tier and upwards, along with an entire library of now over 23 classes and workshops on art fundamentals. And this is along with a second special library that's full of drawing and watercolor tutorials, now over 50, that gets added to each and every month. That's only exclusive for Patreon community members, and I don't share anywhere else. And in that particular class, I explain a bunch of must-know vocabulary and the essential parts to add into the light side and the shadow side when you're trying to render objects realistically, whether it's through drawing or painting. And this particular image that I am sharing with you right now comes from that one class. You can see the core shadow section right here pointed out. Okay, so I am going to explain once again what I did with this third rock, which is basically the same. I'm using the same overall method for all of these, just with different colors. And then I'm gonna leave you with some nice music. So I decided to make this third rock blue, and essentially I am getting started with my base color once again in a very light translucent state. I made sure to pre-wet everything except for the highlights, and I am now dropping in the same color in a more saturated state in areas of cast shadow and a little bit throughout what would be the core shadow in this case. And you can see me drop in a little bit more color, and once I feel I have enough color on my paper, I remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and I go back in with a clean and slightly dampened paintbrush, making sure that I am not going in on wet paper with a bunch of water in my paintbrush bristles, because this can create backgrounds. So stay on top of that water control as much as possible. But there I am using those same techniques, keeping those highlights protected, making sure that I am not darkening lighter value areas that are closer to the light source. Otherwise, if I do darken them, if I don't keep any lighter values, I'm going to flatten everything out and I am going to make this look less realistic. So remember to always visualize and develop a wide range of values and translucencies. That is key to having something look believable and glowy. You want to work with the lightness and the beauty of the paper under that paint. There is definitely a lot of space for play with different textures and techniques when it comes to painting rocks. And I use a few different techniques to create these different textures. In just a bit, you're going to see me use an intentional back run to add a little bit of texture into the left side of this rock. You can also use lifting if you feel at any point in time that you have gone overboard with that paint or you simply want to add some texture. You can go in and do some lifting with your absorbent towel or simply use the bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge. Once again, making sure that they are only slightly damp and not wet. You can create blooms by dropping in a tiny bit of another color into your previous color. A little bit later in this process, when I am painting the pink rock, you're going to see me splatter some water onto drying paint. That can also create a pretty cool rock texture. And finally, while your paint is still wet, you can go in with one of your smaller brushes and do very light scribbling or more linear or curved strokes to move that paint around a tiny bit or do very gentle lifting, and that can help you describe that texture a little bit more. Okay, so before leaving you with some nice music, I just wanted to quickly explain what I did to paint in that area of cast shadow right beneath and to the right of this pile of rocks, in case you want to use a similar technique in your own study. So what I did was I actually pre-wetted this cast shadow shape with clean water. And then with that shape nice and pre-wetted, I dropped in my color in the occlusion shadow area inside of this cast shadow shape. So the occlusion shadow is the darkest section of shadow right closest to the subject, where the mass of the subject is blocking the light from hitting the surface beneath it. I always find that by developing a nice variation in values and translucencies, even within the cast shadow area, paying attention to the occlusion shadow or the area closest to the subject as being the darkest value area within the cast shadow, it just makes things look more believable. And so with that pre-wetted shape, I drop in my dark color closest to the subject. And because I have pre-wetted this section, the color dissipates gradually and softly into that wetness, creating a nice soft transition. And then if you want to darken areas further, you can drop in even more color nearest to the subject, and that color or that darkness is going to be enriched or intensified. Okay, so I'm gonna go quiet now, leave you with some nice music, and I'll be back to explain what I did with the second layer of paint after everything has dried in just a bit. Alright, you guys, so I am done with the very first layer of paint all throughout these rocks and the cast shadow. So I am going to allow everything to dry completely before coming back in and carving some darkest dark areas. Now, I do want to say that this next layer is completely optional. If you like the way that your rock painting looks at this point, by all means, leave it the way it is. There is no need to push forward with the next layer. I just like pushing darkest darks a little bit more because, as I said before, watercolor does tend to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet. So at this point, little areas that we may have considered to be very dark may not look very dark at all anymore. And I just like adding a little bit of contrast into my painting. So whether you want to finish your paintings with just one layer of paint, 2 layers of paint, or 3 layers of paint is totally up to you and your style and kind of what you like. Do take into account that it's very easy to overwork watercolor paintings. This is something that I personally am working on, and the more layers you add to your painting, the more this has a chance to happen. So always remember not to cover up lighter value areas and only darken areas that you really feel you need to push a little bit more. Okay, so what I am doing right here is I am going to be jumping between my different rocks, and I am using the base color that I started with for each one of my rocks, if that makes sense. So I decided to get started with my purple rock, and you can see how I started with my base purple color. And I initially went in to darken the area of cast shadow right beneath the rock that is right on top of that one. That is definitely an area that I wanted to darken a little bit more, and then just a few little areas here and there. I did allow myself to go into these little sections right beneath the rocks, these sections of cast shadow, with a pretty saturated color right off the bat. But with other little sections that I want to push a little bit more throughout that rock, I didn't go in that saturated at all. I was constantly testing out both color as well as level of saturation to translucency on my scrap piece of watercolor paper before going in. And because I am painting on dry paper, I am going to be left with sharp defined edges around the shapes that I paint in. So if I want to soften any of these edges, all I do is remove the color from my paintbrush bristles and go in to run those paintbrush bristles along the edges of that shape, or the edge of the shape that I want to soften, with a clean and slightly damp paintbrush, and that is going to help soften that. So you're going to see me use this softening technique several times in this layer of paint. But it is important to acknowledge that you don't have to feel the need to soften all of your edges out. You can certainly feel free to leave some sharp defined edges and then soften others out so that you can have a combination between harder, more defined edges and then softer edges, softer transitions. Throughout the last part of this painting process, you're just going to see me jump around from rock to rock. And I'm trying to acknowledge these darker value little areas as abstract shapes as opposed to outlines. I'm really staying away from the illusion of any sort of outline because that is going to retract from the realism of this piece. And I'm also staying away from blocky shapes, distracting shapes or marks, and anything like that that is way too organized, because all of that is not going to look very natural at all. All right, so I'm gonna do my best to jump around and keep it loose and just describe what I want to describe with the least amount of brush strokes as possible, doing my best to not allow myself to get too finicky, and I'm gonna leave my painting be. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did. And if so, please make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you get immediate access to my most exclusive resources in the form of real-time, step-by-step, fully narrated tutorials that I don't share anywhere else. All of the tutorials that I share over on Patreon include my downloadable outline sketch, my high-resolution reference photos, and my supply lists, including the list of specific colors that I use for the piece on hand. Patreon community members also have access to my weekly sketchbook prompts, which are designed to help you stay consistent and making progress as an artist. There's also a library of classes on art fundamentals that now has over 20 classes in it, and that gets added to each and every month. Monthly live Q&A sessions with me, in which community members get to ask me anything they'd like, feedback from me on your work, and much more. So go ahead and check it out. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, so you can pick whichever one you need. I'm gonna make sure to leave a link to that down below in the description box. Alright everyone, that is going to do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it, that you learned something new, or that you found it inspiring. If you did like it, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and allows more artists to get to know about my channel. Thank you so very much for watching today. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments for me, make sure to leave them down below in the comment section. I always love hearing from you guys and read every single one of your comments. Don't forget to subscribe so that I can see you next week for another video, and stay inspired. Bye guys!